Hello, welcome to part 3 about Tom Crean. Tom Crean, back in the mundane life in the Navy, was transferred to HMS Pembroke 1st October 1904. Then, in February 1905, Crean was transferred to HMS Vernon at Portsmouth, a torpedo school where Crean bumped into his Discovery comrade Taff Evans, who was petty officer first class at the gunnery school. Scott at this time was writing his book called The Voyage of the Discovery and was published on 12 October 1905, with a copy sent to Tom Crean with a request to join Scott when Scott is back at sea and Tom be his coxswain. Tom agreed, and in September 1906, Scott and Tom reunited on the battleship HMS Victorious in the Atlantic Fleet. What is strange about this, Tom and Scott weren't close friends, but Tom's reliability had impressed Scott. Then, in early 1907, both men were on the HMS Albemarle, then 1908 HMS Essex, and HMS Bulwark, which at this time Shackleton, along with Frank Wild, Jameson Adams, and Eric Marshall, went to the Antarctic to beat Scott's record, which they did. But news reported on March 1909, at the same time Scott was on a train to London, Shackleton had returned on Nimrod, back to England. And even though Shackleton and his team were only 97 miles away from the South Pole, they were suffering from scurvy. Shackleton ended the expedition, and Shackleton knew Scott would hear this news and knew Scott would set out to reach the South Pole. And Shackleton was right, because while Scott conflicted to head back to the Antarctic, Scott made the decision on the train to London to head back to the Antarctic, and he had every intention to get Crean, Lashley, and Taff Evans to join him and raise the money for the expedition. But what Scott didn't realize, it will become a race to the South Pole between him and Amundsen, a well-experienced Norwegian explorer. So Scott set out to raise the money, and unlike Markham and Shackleton, Scott didn't have a very warm personality, to say the least, to raise £40,000 for the British Antarctic expedition. But £20,000 was donated by the Liberal government, £750 between the Royal Geographical Society and the Royal Society, £1,000 by a cavalryman, Lawrence Titus Oates, who would also be part of the expedition, £25 at Wolverhampton in a gathering, also by subscriptions, and the men who signed on to join either gave donations themselves or by accepting decrease in their nominal wages. But there was another problem. The ship. Discovery was busy in Canada. So the ship available was one of the relief ships, Terra Nova. The down payment was £5,000 and further £7,500 when the funds became available. While getting the money was still a problem, there was no problem gaining recruits, with 8,000 willing volunteers. The first expedition had alerted the British public about the Antarctic, but it was the failed attempt by Shackleton that really roused the public to get to the South Pole. People who joined were Tom Crean as petty officer, Taff Evans and Lashley as chief stoker, Petty Officer William Heald, Dr. Wilson, and since it too was a scientific expedition like the last one, Scott took on meteorologists, geologists, physicists, biologists, a motor engineer Bernard Day to look after the tractors, and a 40-year-old photographer Herbert Ponton, by the recommendations of Dr. Wilson. Scott's number 2 was one of the relief ships Edward Evans, also known as Teddy Evans, and Lawrence Oates to look after the Siberian ponies, and 2 Russians, Dmitri and Anton. Also, a Norwegian called Crean, who is a ski expert. Cecil, hired to look after the dogs. Then came the 1st of June 1910 with 60 men, 30 dogs, 19 ponies, and supplies that last 2 years in the Antarctic. Terra Nova sailed out of the Thames to head to Cardiff, Wales to gather free coal and more donations of £14,000, while the majority came from the people of Cardiff, £2,500. But before Terra Nova arrived at Cardiff, Scott convinced the men to make a will before they head south. Yeah, they really needed to do that. Anyway, and when Terra Nova finally arrived at the docks of Cardiff, a banquet was held for the men, especially for the officers. But Scott invited the crew to join as well, and Taff Evans from South Wales sat between Scott and the Lord Mayor. But Taff had a bit too much to drink, and 6 of the crewmen had to get Taff back on the ship. Eventually, on the 15th of June, Terra Nova set sail south. But Scott stayed behind to gather more donations. But he eventually rendezvoused with Terra Nova at Simonstown, South Africa, then sailed to Melbourne through the Indian Ocean. And Terra Nova arrived at Melbourne 12 October 1910 with a telegram waiting for Scott. It said, "Beg to inform you, Fram proceeding Antarctic. Amundsen." Now Scott knows the race to the South Pole has begun. But Terra Nova must make another stop at Lyttelton, New Zealand on the 28th October 1910. The same dock would start Tom Crean's career as an Antarctic explorer under Discovery 9 years before. The ship stayed about a month, finishing off preparations, and Scott, Wilson, and Teddy Evans' wives met them at Lyttelton, while some of the crew took the chance to feel the grass before they felt the snow. Then Terra Nova arrived at Dunedin 26 November for a short stay and left on 29th November to its final destination, the Antarctic. The ship was weighed down by supplies, animals, and food, but still Terra Nova plowed on. And while Teddy Evans mentions it looked like a floating farmyard and the crew was squashed together below like sardines, unfortunately the Southern Ocean wasn't as calm as it was when Discovery was plowed through to the Antarctic. Terra Nova ran into a 36-hour raging force 10 gale, and it was very close to capsizing. The waves were apparently as high as 25 feet, and when a wave washed one of the dogs overboard, a different wave brought the dog back on board the ship. One of the crew, called Bowers, even mentions the force scale went up to 11. But the crew above the deck, according to Scott, could be heard roaring sea shanties. Sailors. Awesome. After toiling through the storm, 2 dogs and 2 ponies died, and a lot of coal was lost. But Terra Nova finally arrived on the Antarctic Circle on 10th December and made good progress. If the crew wished to get to the South Pole before the Amundsen crew, they would need to make good progress. Tom Crean added another animal to the floating farmyard, a rabbit he got while in New Zealand, and on Christmas Day Scott wrote, "An event of Christmas was the production of a family by Crean's rabbit. She gave birth to 17, it is said, and Crean has given away 22. I don't know what will become of the parent or family. At present, they are warm and snug enough, tucked away in the fodder under the forecastle. Terra Nova arrived at McMurdo Sound on New Year's Eve, but this time nearer to Mount Erebus, where the ground is more even. And the area was called Cape Evans by Scott after Teddy Evans, and a hut was erected for the 25-men party to spend during the Antarctic winter. But Terra Nova didn't reach land until the 4th of January, which caused an issue because they were late, and put pressure on them to get what needs to be done before the Antarctic winter set in. The first thing to do, offload supplies and equipment, then erect a hut. Scott also wanted supplies to be laid at depots in the Great Ice Barrier for the next season trip to the South Pole, before the weather gets worse. The men worked 17 hours a day and used the dogs and ponies to help them to get everything done before the winter arrived. Crean was in charge of one of the ponies, bringing 11,000 pounds of supplies for the wintering party. But an issue which would be a pain to Scott's butt, which Scott said day of disaster, because one of the 3 motor tractors plunged through the ice and went down 120 in the icy cold water. Now the power of the tractors is 3.5 miles per hour. Yeah, it's slow, but it would help bring lots of supplies to its destinations and not have the men hauling too much. Scott ordered the remaining 2 tractors not to be used until the sea is firmly frozen. Then on the 18th of January, the party moved into the hut, which was their home for 2 years. A simple scientific outing led by Campbell found a few surprises. While sailing along the barrier to the Bay of Whales, Campbell, Raymond Priestley, geologist, Murray Levick, a surgeon, and the seamen George Abbott, Frank Browning, and Harry Dickinson came across Amundsen's ship, Fram. Campbell spoke to the crew and ate with them and offered them lunch at Terra Nova. Of course, both parties were trying to find out what each other knew, how far each other were from the pole. On 24th of January 1911, a 13-man party, Scott, Teddy Evans, Wilson, Oates, Bowers, and Dimitri, went on the first expedition, and Crean was leading a pony called Blossom, along with 8 other ponies carrying 570 pounds of supplies, along with 26 dogs. The party were hauling a combined total of 5,385 pounds of 14 weeks' supplies of food and fuel. Crean briefly interrupted the routine because he went to the old Discovery hut at Hut Point, just to reminisce since it was 7 years he was last in this area. Eventually, the party went back on track, but a problem arose. The surgeon, Edward Atkinson, had developed an issue in his heel caused by chafing after leaving Cape Evans. The party reached safety camp, but the condition on the heel didn't improve, so Scott made a decision to request Crean stay with the surgeon while the rest of the party continued on. Scott wrote in his diary, Atkinson and Crean remained behind, very hard on the latter. Atkinson suffering much pain and mental distress at his condition. For the latter, I cannot have much sympathy, as he ought to have reported his trouble long before. Crean will manage to rescue some more of the forage from the barrier edge. I am very sorry for him. Gran, the Norwegian, put it more simply. It isn't funny to be ill here. Crean, without a doubt, was disappointed he couldn't continue in this expedition, but Scott relies on him to make sure Atkinson will be looked after. A spare tent and Primo's stove was left with them. The weather was deteriorating for the 11-man party, and the ponies weren't much good either. Whatever fate Scott had for the ponies suffered badly. The ponies were weaker than expected, and even though Oates looked after them, the ponies weren't suitable for the task. But Scott was too concerned about the dogs since he could never use the dogs properly for driving and handling them. Scott had such high hopes the ponies would carry much of the burden to ease the men hauling the sledges themselves, but it is looking that isn't the case. So where did Scott get the ponies? He sent Mears, who had no expertise of the equine, to get the ponies from Russia. But when the ponies arrived in Britain, Oates, the cavalryman, was shocked to see how poor looking the ponies were. If Scott had sent Oates instead, then Oates himself would have gotten better ponies for the expedition. But there was news. Bad news. Scott reunited with Teddy Evans at Hut Point. When Teddy showed the letter to Scott, it mentions Amerson Camp 400 miles at Bay of Whales. Scott now knows where Amerson is. Even though Scott is wondering how Amerson is able to use 120 dogs on the ice properly before going on any serious expedition, Amerson first traveled to the very top of Norway and understood how to use the dogs properly. Meanwhile, Crean and Ankerson reunited with the party at Hut Point. On 24th of February, Crean and Scott were back in the harness, heading to Corner Camp to meet Bowers, a Marine lieutenant, and Cherry Garrard. Eventually, on the 28th of February, Scott ordered Bowers to head back to Hut Point alone with one of the remaining ponies, until Crean and Cherry were to take the remaining ponies with them to catch up with Bowers, while Scott would stay behind with Oates and Grant to nurse the sick pony back to health. Eventually, the two men caught up to Bowers, and the three men came to the sea ice, which is adjacent to Cape Armitage near Hut Point. But the ice was moving, so the possibility of ice breaking was high, which it did later. Crean, wary of the danger, suggested they move further west where the ice is more firmer, but Bowers, inexperienced and on his first expedition, Antarctic expedition, was unsure and pushed on through the dangerous ice. The ice was 1.3 to 5 meters thick, but the water was squelching through. They could feel the ice breaking. Plus, the ponies were getting exhausted, and darkness was descending, and a swirling mist was forming. So, Bowers decided to make camp for the night. Ice was gathered to melt to make hot cocoa, but Bowers got the bag mixed up between the curry powder and the cocoa. Crean drank a hot cup of curry. But that wasn't the worst of it. Oh no, that wasn't the worst of it. At 4:30 in the morning, the three men woke up to a loud noise. The ice broke. One of the ponies was missing, and sledges were on another floe. Then their floe split in two. But the men couldn't stay. Their floe was moving towards the open sea. So they got the sledge and the ponies, and the men moved from one floe to the next to find a firmer ice. But another problem arose: killer whales. The whales usually bump into the floe to knock the penguins and seals off to get a lovely meal. Eventually, a floe stopped at the side of the barrier, and Crean volunteered to get help by jumping the rest of the floe to climb the 15 to 20-foot cliff. Bowers gave him supplies and a note for Scott. Crean started to jump across the floes, waiting for some to be close to jump to get to the barrier, and started the climb. Crean got to the top and went to the depot safety point. Gran saw Crean, and the note was given to Scott, and he organized a rescue party. Not only were they themselves at safety camp, and was surprised Crean came all the way by himself to get help for Bowers and Cherry Garrard, but also led Scott and Oates to Bowers and Cherry Garrard to rescue the men. And for his troubles, Crean was suffering from snow blindness. On the 16th of March, Crean was in an 8-man party on its last expedition before the winter set in. But the temperatures were already low as minus 40 degrees Celsius, and visibility was already down by 10 yards and the winds 30 miles per hour. So the party left Corner Camp and arrived at Hut Point on 24th of March, and the men were waiting for the sea to freeze over. Unfortunately, they had to wait until the 11th of April before they could set out to Cape Evans. But the days were shortening, and they set out nonetheless. A few of the men were concerned, but thankfully the men arrived, and they were greeted with a warm welcome by their comrades they had not seen for 3 months. Eventually the men went back to Hut Point to pick up Wilson and 6 men who stayed behind. On the 21st of April, the bulk of the team went back to Cape Evans, exhausted after the 3 months of work laying supplies at the depots was finished. But Emerson and his men of fellow Norwegians were traveling 25 miles a day. And it was this that gave Scott anxiety. But Emerson had better dogs that can travel further and bring more supplies. Scott decided the pole expedition would venture at 10:30 a.m. 24th October 1911. The 2 tractors will pull 6,290 pounds of stores of supplies, pony food, and petrol in 6 sledges, which was the hope it will save the ponies struggling on the expedition. However, tractors didn't help as much as expected, since in the first 3 hours the tractors only covered 3 miles, and after many breakdowns the tractors were abandoned on the 1st of November. The 12-man party, along with 10 ponies and 23 dogs, left Cape Evans on the same day, and Scott forgot the Union Jack and asked Grant to go back to the camp to get it. He did, and he was the only Norwegian to have carried the Union Jack to the South Pole. Meanwhile, Amundsen started earlier on the 19th of October with a 5-man team with 52 dogs. Back to Scott. It isn't going well because light snow is making it difficult for the ponies carrying 700 pounds of supplies, and for the men too, because both would sink deep into the snow. On 10th of November, Scott was getting more concerned about the conditions of the ponies. While on the 13th, the ponies were finding it more difficult to be able to march through the snow. And on the 21st of November, the 12-man party only managed to travel 192 miles in 21 days, traveling 9 miles a day and 700 miles from the South Pole, while Emerson was 300 miles from the South Pole. But a few days later, Scott rearranged the team. Hopper and Day were sent back to Cape Evans, and the 12-man party was split into a 3 group of 4. But the weather deteriorated and the blizzard stalled the expeditions for 4 days. Because of the blizzard, the men were behind schedule, returning back to Cape Evans after reaching the pole, and the window of safety was closing and rations were depleting. But still they carried on. If they wanted to turn back, as far as I know, it wasn't mentioned. Maybe they should have turned back. Anyway. But the men now had to climb 120 miles on the Beardmore to get to the polar plateau, while hauling 170 pounds, and the party was rearranged again. On 11th December, supplies were dropped at Lower Glacier Depot for the returning party. Dimitri and Mears were sent back to Cape Evans with a note from Scott for his wife Kathleen, literally complaining that the expedition wasn't going so well. The journey was proving more and more difficult. The three four-men party covered 4 miles on the 13th of December, while on the 14th the men covered 10 miles. But on the same day, Amundsen and his 4 men at 3 p.m. reach the South Pole. The race is over. But Scott, 300 miles away, doesn't know this. But now the men were thinking who will be on the final team going to the pole. But on Christmas Day, Crean, Bowers, and Lashley were hauling when the ice broke and Lashley plunged into the gaping hole, pulling Crean and Bowers. But both of the men were alright, but they couldn't see Lashley. But he shouted out to them he was alright. If he didn't replace his rope days before, it would be a different story. But to get Lashley out of there, first they had to get Crean and Bowers out first. Eventually Lashley was helped out and he avoided a 50-foot drop. What a way for Lashley to spend his 44th birthday. It was back to business the morning after, but fatigue was creeping, especially on Lashley, who hauled 700 miles. But on New Year's Eve, Scott asked Lashley, Crean, Bowers, and Teddy Evans to abandon their skis, while Scott and the others kept theirs. Yeah. Taff Evans cut his hand very badly while walking on the sledge. He didn't report it to Wilson nor to Scott, most likely because he wanted to be part of the final team to the pole, which he was. While Crean, Teddy Evans, and Lashley were told by Scott on 3rd of January to return to Cape Evans. You can imagine the disappointment of the men, especially Crean, but Crean wished them well and a safe journey to the pole and back. Then saw the 5-man team walk away and become smaller and smaller in the distance. And that is all. Till next time. Slán.